Thank you so much for taking time out on a wet Vancouver night, another wet Vancouver night, to celebrate the publication of Dr. Joanne Leow's first academic monograph, Counter-Cartographies, Reading Singapore Otherwise, which was published by the University of Liverpool Press earlier this year. My name is Nadine Atwell, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University. I also direct the Global Asia program, which is excited to be co-hosting tonight's event, together with the Department of English and the David Lamb Center. A big thank you to administrative staff with English and the David Lamb Center, who have been indispensable, as they always are, throughout the process of organizing this event. You've met some of them probably tonight. On a more fundamental level, our gathering today is made possible by local as well as global infrastructures of colonial and capitalist violence as they intersect in the places where we live, work, and know. And Joanne's book is about those infrastructures. We are currently located on lands first known to and cherished by Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples, and expropriated for use by settlers, including non-white settlers like myself. In addition, this neighborhood has long been home to Indigenous people from across the continent and to Chinese, Japanese, and Black communities living in complex, sometimes tense, always vital relation with one another. We are also gathering in the shadow of several unfolding genocides, including in Palestine. All of these histories draw us into relationships of responsibility that inform, or should inform, our conversations together. So the sort of agenda for tonight is that Dr. Leow will speak about counter-cartographies for about 25 to 30 minutes. And then Drs. Bogle, Barwawi, and me will engage in a brief conversation about the book. We'll talk sort of through some of our sort of thoughts and feelings about the book, and leaving time for questions. Please feel free to get up and grab some food and drink if you need it. And I think I'll introduce you and then turn things over to you. So, and then I'll introduce Cornell and Nasri as we go. So I'm so happy to welcome Dr. Joanne Leow to introduce her book. Joanne Leow grew up in Singapore and lives on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. She is an associate professor and Tier 2 Canada Research Chair of Transnational and Decolonial Digital Humanities in the Department of English at SFU. Her first academic monograph is Counter-Cartographies, but she is also a poet and writer with a debut collection of poetry, Seas Move Away. Her creative work and research lie at the intersections of the environmental humanities, transnational and diasporic cultural production, global Asia studies, autotheory, and decoloniality.
Thank you so much, Nadine, and thank you to all of you so much for coming. Your presence means a great deal to me, and before I begin, I'd like to thank again my fellow panelists, Nadine, Cornell, my dear friend and collaborator, Nasri, who came all the way from Seattle this morning to join us here tonight. Just plugging your talk tomorrow, he'll be giving a talk on literary translation and rewriting of two classical animal stories from the Indian Ocean and Malay Archipelago. That's 4 p.m. at the SFU Harbor Center, room 1415, so please join us then. And Nasri's work on cultural production from the Malay Archipelago in the larger field of Indian Ocean cultural studies is vital and groundbreaking, and I hope that his insights into Singapore studies will allow us to have a conversation about my book and so much more. I'm also honored to have my colleagues Nadine contextualize my work in the field of global Asia studies, and Cornell to think through the overlapping and intersecting post-colonial contexts of Singapore and the Caribbean, and specifically Jamaica, island states. I also admire all three of your works, and I look forward to our conversations this evening and beyond. I know I'm reiterating gratitude, but much gratitude to the David Lamb Center, the Department of English, my colleagues who are here tonight, the Global Asia program for their support of this event, and specifically to Doris, Rebecca, Lynn, and Emily for all their hard work on this event, and thanks as well to my favorite Malaysian colleague in SFU, Chris Chong, for helping me secure this beautiful venue. Where are you, Chris? There you are. Okay. So before I begin, I'd like to make some acknowledgements as well. We are on the unceded traditional Coast Salish lands and waters, including the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. And as someone who was born and educated and spent many years of her working life in the post-colony of Singapore, I am acutely aware of the privilege that I enjoyed as an Anglophone Chinese woman there, and of the power and status that that history and my position here afford me. My family and I benefited from many aspects of British colonialism as we helped, quote-unquote, settle the Crown Colony and Republic of Singapore in the Malay Archipelago. And I'm also thinking through then the larger implications of my work. All of us here on the panel, and I'm sure in the audience, have been deeply affected by the genocide occurring in Palestine and in other places, as you mentioned, but with the violence now and immediately spreading to southern Lebanon. So tonight I also want to acknowledge that we are almost a year into the US-sponsored genocide in Gaza, not that Canada is any less complicit, as part of a brutal 76-year-old dispossession of Palestinian people from their indigenous lands. I deplore the complicity of many of our academic institutions in this current genocide, and I call for Simon Fraser University in particular to divest from corporations engaged in military arms production. I and my fellow panelists stand in solidarity with the people of Gaza, Palestine, Lebanon, and call for an end to Israeli occupation and apartheid. As a scholar of empire and mapping and how this produces spatial and ecological control, I cannot help but see deep resonances in the logic of settlement master plans in Singapore and Palestine. And in my other work, I have also thought about the grid-like colonial port cities that planners imposed on indigenous coastlines of Singapore and what we now call Vancouver. So my book, Counter-Cartographies, Reading Singapore Otherwise, is concerned with colonial and neo-colonial cartographies as they relate to a spatial control population, its ecologies, and its cultural production. It is also a book that is in conversation with Singaporean writers, filmmakers, and artists to theorize how they've managed to work in spite of these conditions. So here I'm drawing on a larger history of planned maps Singapore, and you can see these master plans up here above me, but really what I wanted to say on a more effective level in my own personal history is that to be Singaporean is to come to terms with demolitions, development, the pace of physical change, a permanent territorial revolution, as Rodolphe de Connick calls it, and so forth, and all these that occur without warning through powers that are beyond our control. So the book is my attempt to see beyond the state's vision. Rest in peace, James C. Scott, passed away recently. And to develop another way of reading the country of my birth, my childhood, my first job. Authoritarian urban planning, beginning in the colonial era, now also extends to how much or how little power we have in Singapore and other places over the spaces we live in, write in, perform in, gather in, and move through. So the work that I've been doing is, I suppose, in resistance to the master plan. Here's Singapore Master Plan 2025. And they're enabling particular forms of spatial control that have defined Singapore spaces since independence and proleptically into the future. In the first part of my book, I think through Gardens by the Bay in Singapore, an eco-development, there's a horticultural garden, a sort of fantastical new botanical gardens. And I think through this space as an exemplar of planned space. From its origins as reclaimed land with sand seized from other shores and estuaries, to the construction of a simulacrum of highly planned, climate-controlled, manicured, and controlled botanical spaces. So the site you're seeing now is the site in construction, and the pylons that you see there on your right are essentially what are going to be called super trees, but you can see they're concrete pylons. And so this is planning a spectacle as taming of nature, as the use of nature as camouflage for infrastructure that functions metonymically as a symbol for Singapore's orderly material success under the People's Action Party, the one party that's been ruling the nation state since independence. So if you're Singaporean or have lived in Singapore, this will be a very famous set of photographs. In his 1995 speech for the opening of the National Orchid Garden, Lee Kuan Yew opined, Singapore today is a verdant city where abundant greenery softens the landscape. This was no accident of nature. it is the result of a deliberate 30-year policy which required political will and sustained effort to carry out. Many of these dramatic post-colonial transformations were thus led by the Gardener-in-Chief, Lee Kuan Yew, who deemed this necessary to, quote, distinguish Singapore from other third world countries by transforming it into a tropical garden city that met, quote unquote, first world standards, the Switzerland of Asia. Lee's vision of a tropical garden city was actually, well, also an authoritarian fantasy of a, quote, clean and green Singapore, in effect marrying the lushness of an ideal tropics with the purity and orderliness of a regimented and regulated society. So projects like Gardens by the Bay, and this is a photograph of Singapore Airport, Changi Jewel, yes, it is an airport, are how, as Ginny Kim Watson argues, the authoritarian state's success is legible to its population and other countries. And the national scale of the built environment's reconstruction allows the PAP, People's Action Party, commitment to the national project to be read symbolically and internalized by the population. Such powerful signs also signify the path of Singapore's future through the assumption of consent, that is, the population's desire for freedom through material improvement. So to this end, to see the Palestinian protest banner go up in this vista, this space, was incredibly compelling for me and other like-minded individuals. Because clearly the Singaporean protesters in this image understood that the spectacle and view of Gardens by the Bay was a state-written text, is a state-written text, and they knew how to mobilize this for the highest amount of visibility. So you may have thousands, hundreds of thousands of people taking the streets to protest the genocide, but in Singapore, 3 people unfurling a banner, I think pretty much has the same impact. Yes, he agrees. So my book goes on to extrapolate the state's control of space in Singapore as one that is intimately tied to censorship and control over discourse, culture, and the arts, and the managing of material and symbolic discursive spaces in Singapore, the overly one-dimensional narratives and authoritarian laws dispensed by the state. These texts have been the most vulnerable to the long arm of censorship and oversight. And yet, on the global stage, and even within the country, the pressure of this power and this rigidity is not often outly visible, glossed over as it is by the spectacle, the city in a garden. So the objective of my book is to carefully pierce this cartographical vision by examining a series of counter-cartographical texts, literature, artwork, films, and cultural artifacts. This assemblage of texts attempts, as I do, to read Singapore otherwise. And I want to emphasize as well that what really struck me as I started working on this project was the sheer generic plurality and the polyphony of these texts as a testament to the potent and ever-evolving resistance to a nimble, efficiently calibrated authoritarian state. Art and culture here are producing an alternate political geography of the state. It's the pressure and duress that are creating new forms and new ways of artistic creation. So I'm going to give you a sort of brief look into the methodology of the book. I'm tracing texts that excavate, circumvent, wayfind, and confabulate alternatives in the context of social and legal controls. And I don't just seek to document and theorize the means of artistic and imaginative resistance. My book wants to reveal the unseen boundaries imposed in acts of artistic performance and creation in the highly planned and regulated city-state, and the methods used to suppress alternate decolonial and anti-authoritarian productions of space. In the Singaporean context, artists, filmmakers, and writers are always cognizant of the histories and contemporary realities of violence, repression, detention without trial, death penalty for minor offenses, discrimination against LGBTQ communities and racialized minorities, the curtailed rights of migrant workers within the country. And indeed, some of the crackdowns in the 1980s and beyond were specifically due to theater and its potentialities. So the terms that I put up here on the slide, excavate, circumvent, wayfind, and confabulate, are all spatially oriented and reflect both the ways in which I read the text and the artistic and imaginative moves that are being made in the text themselves. And these 4 spatial and theoretical movements deliberately enmesh the space of everyday life in time, in historical context, in ongoing social relations, in contemporary political realities, and in possible futures. If the state sees only what it wants to see and shapes material reality in its vision, this study seeks other ways of seeing that are not panoptic, reductive, or restrictive. It asks us to see and read conscious of our memories, our bodies, and our imagined futures. So I'm going to give you an overview of the book chapters and their organizing concepts. The first chapter begins with a theorization of excavation. I examine texts by conceptual artist Charles Lim, documentary filmmakers Kalyan Imam and Tan Pin Pin, and the artist and writer Ila. Their works, which range from documentary film to conceptual installations, to essays, photographs, and documentary film again, show how it is to depict Singapore's ground as unstable and impermanent. What acts of excavation allow are not just an understanding of how spaces were in the past, but what was there before, but how the present space is a concentration of intersections and relations. Excavating as praxis is bearing witness to the material, the passage of time as is implicated in spatial change, and the attention to records and record keeping. It is a remedial process, and their work insists on digging up what seem to be illegible spaces on the map, the intertidal zones, the archipelagic nature of Singapore, the seas that surround it, the caverns it gouges out from its bedrock, and the ruins and demolished buildings that underpin so much of its infrastructure. What has the mapping of Singapore sought to destroy, misremember, or erase? Artistic and literary excavations in Singapore are always necessarily incomplete and fragmentary. The archives, tools, and freedoms that the artists have are circumscribed, censored, or absent. And they are counter-cartographical because they refuse the homogeneity of discipline, mapped, abstract, and legible space in favor of depictions of excess, of the unsettling and unsettled, the deep fissures of race desire, ecological harm, inherent in Singapore's post-colonial spaces. In chapter 2, I move to circumvention, which asks what the artist does in the presence of real obstacles, material and symbolic, in mapped space. And these take the form of borders, maritime barriers, or domestic walls, as they suggest political exile, detentions, and other exclusions. In literary and cultural terms, the contours of power further manifest themselves in the restrictions on archives, censorship from the authorities, or the withdrawal of funding for spaces of creation and art. So my chapter asks what acts of subterfuge and evasion must happen for works of art that are created in the context of colonially mapped, neo-colonially planned space. And so my argument here is that acts of overreaching, outwitting, and making a circuit, or finding a way around, become necessary as acts of counter-cartography when faced with subjects that are banned, histories that are erased, and the spaces of the state that are out of bounds. I consider what is entailed for those who must orient themselves differently in Singapore, who must circumvent the state's authoritarianism or fail in their attempts to do so. If the spaces that I discuss require specific and regimented orientations and correct ways for bodies to act within these spaces, what happens when minority subjects in Singapore cannot or will not adhere to the proper orientations, whether political, economic, or sexual? In these cases, circumvention becomes a tactic of survival against the erasure of alternate spaces in the city. I'm not going to give many specific examples just in the interest of time, but I did want to highlight this particular film that has stayed with me ever since I watched it. And this is a film called To Singapore with Love, and it's been banned by the state. And I stick with it because it enables us to reconsider the spaces of the state from outside its borders. The film's preoccupation with spatial journeying and movement as it films completely outside the borders contrasts the fixed position of the nation, suggesting that different forms of Singaporean nationalism have been and are being cultivated outside the country's borders in a kind of centripetal motion. By focusing on the quotidian textures of exiled life, and here you see screenshots from featuring portraits of many of the exiles that she's interviewed. This text contests the celebratory global and transnational aspects of the city-state and its supposedly mobile subjects. It circles the island's maritime borders to produce a lived experience of exile. It shows us how the bodies of men and women banned from entering the country are themselves living and forgotten archives of of a series of complex moments in the nation's history. While excavation and circumvention directly grapple with and confront the spatial authority that is wielded by the state, the second half of the book attempts theorizations of alternative decolonial space-making. In my third chapter, I consider how to wayfind, which, as Timothy Ingle has argued, is not to navigate by a map. To wayfind, he writes, one must specify a current location in relation to where one has been or where one is going. Wayfinding as an element of counter-cartographies and reading is to see each literary and cultural text trajectory in space as profoundly intertextual and interdiscursive. It is a methodology that is attention to narrative unfolding, always conscious of the unexpected and of the intensely sensorial and emotional experience of the text as it is moving through space. So I see a subversive wayfinding in the routes, paths, moments, and landmarks of Kelvin Tong's short film, Grandma Positioning System, Tan Sheyi's experimental memoir, Lost Road Singapore, and Alfian Satsmali's sketches, a collection of flash fictions, and all these works that complicate the regulated spatial temporalities that the state produces. Literary wayfinding is both an act of writing and reading and creating, giving us what can be seen, but also what can no longer be seen, as in the case of Kelvin Tong's film Ghosts, and what can be heard and what can no longer be heard, and the story that is coming to being and changing even as it is being narrated. And these are not just confined to loss or death, they are ongoing and ever-evolving. In the final chapter, I turn fully to the possibilities of speculative fiction to imagine otherwise. I think of the word of confabulate as to fabricate imaginary experiences in compensation for amnesia. And in the Singaporean context, my theorization of the term points to the role of fiction in the production of powerful imagined and symbolic spaces. If the map state began with colonial, bureaucratic fictions based on racialization, the disenfranchisement of minorities, and the exploitation of space, how might we examine and imagine otherwise? So I'm looking at these confabulatory literary urbanisms produced by artists, architects, writers, which raise intriguing possibilities about the role of the text in the planned city. Confabulation creates a social space, it compensates for collective loss of memory through fabrication and imagination. So I look at a play, Hotel, by Alvin Satt and Marcia van der Straten, a collection of essays and short stories and interviews, Dream Stories by Clara Chow, and the award-winning book, The Art of Charlie Chan Hop Chai by Simon Leow. So these books depart from historical sources to project potential futures, whether they're untold stories of a historic hotel room, an imaginary artist who provides a cheeky counter-narrative to Singapore's official history, or unbuilt and unbuildable buildings on the island, enabling us to see the unmappable aspects of Singapore's map space. I love to think about it as the ways in which these artists and writers might mislead us, as they have been recently become attentive to different modes of understanding history through speculative literary fictions. They attempt and imagine intimate counterfactual histories, speculate on alternate presents and futures, and engage in fantastical musings that are still anchored in material spaces of the city. I realize this is a really general overview. I didn't give you very specific examples of the text, but I just wanted to end by thinking about coming back to what this actually means in the material spaces of Singapore. So does anyone recognize the dude in the middle? You may not be as familiar with the gentlemen that flank him on each side. Vivian Balakrishnan is the Foreign Affairs Minister of Singapore, and I'm not even sure what Ong Ye Kung is at the moment, but he's in the government. He got demoted to health. So this apparently was the first ever selfie taken by Kim Jong-un in Gardens by the Bay, so you can see the floral backdrop there. Just bear with me. So in 2018, I seem to have lost my spot here. In 2018, there was a North Korean United States Singapore summit that was held to bring together these two wonderful people. people. And the planning process that surrounded it are peak examples of the perfection of Singapore's control over its urban spaces and populace. And in just 2 weeks, the state was able to gazette 2 separate spaces in downtown Singapore and the offshore island of Sentosa as quote-unquote special event areas under the extensive Public Order Act first enacted in 2017. These included measures to search vehicles and persons entering these areas and further the prohibition of multiple items in the restricted zone. Some of the items obviously were explosives, arms, flammable materials banned for clear safety issues, but most of the list of outlaw materials, however, reflected a clear attempt to suppress freedom of expression and assembly in the space, blocking devices for peaceful protests, aerosol paints, a public address system. And the Gazette was an effective tool that capitalized on the exceptional nature of the Trump-Kim summit to justify its highly restrictive rules. It made legible the spatial restrictions that were already present in much of Singapore's urban spaces, where governmental permission must be granted for assemblies, protests, street art, vigils, and artistic performances that do not neatly fall within the acceptable notions of the state's chartered existence. And these restrictions against textual materials, such as flags, banners, and spray paint, clearly limited the means of political expression within the designated zones down to the smallest detail. The ban on loud hailers and other means of amplification was a legal reminder of the continual silencing of non-state voices in these spaces. And additional measures to search and examine every person entering the zone further subjected bodies in these spaces to surveillance and policing. The speed and transparency of these legal maneuvers and the population's acquiescence point simply to the efficient machinery of an already securitized and planned space. And these measures were an augmentation of the tensions, inequalities, and panoptic suppressions that exist to keep Singapore's ecology, spaces, and citizens in check. Indeed, the summit was an event that made evident how Singapore now markets itself on a global stage as a city that has seamlessly integrated its histories of colonial planning, architecture, and legal systems into a cosmopolitan, globalized, and authoritarian city-state. Map Singapore, Plan Singapore, post-colonial Singapore intersect in these depictions. As Cheryl Naruse has pointed out, right there, Singapore has long been framed in terms of its strategic utility on a global stage, securitized, touristic, and economic. So I'm wondering, and I started wondering when I wrote the book, and I'm still thinking about it, what art and writing can be made in these tightly controlled contexts. The practitioners that I have examined have a slightly different, if not more urgent query. What art and writing must be produced in these contexts? And they do so from their minoritized vantage point in a precarious context where Singapore's apparent success is celebrated by illiberal governments of larger countries in Asia and beyond, who seek to learn from its so-called soft authoritarianism. In the face of state amnesia, what might excavations of histories long suppressed or disappeared produce? Against the centralization of power, what repeated circumventions are necessary to elucidate the contours of control? What routes and trajectories of wayfinding are crucial in challenging increasing spatial controls? And finally, how does one imagine what could have been and what might yet to be in a city where so much space and history has already been tightly mapped out? So the rich textual, artistic, and filmic possibilities that I've drawn from this study provide a sharp counterpoint, what I am calling a counter-cartography of the city-state.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for introducing us to your book. We are going to begin with Nasri. So Nasri is an assistant professor of Southeast Asian literature and culture at the University of Washington in Seattle. His current research examines the intersections between animal fables and racial discourses in Malay Indonesian literary films, literary texts, films, and visual art. This is hard to manage. He's published on racialism, folklore, literary Islam, and translation as cultural rewriting in maritime Southeast Asia in relation to other Indian Ocean cultures and global Anglophone Muslim texts and films. He's held visiting fellowships at MIT, the University of Brighton, UK's National Centre for Writing, and the Toji Foundation in South Korea. He's an editor-at-large at Mowafaghian literary magazine for international contemporary writing and serves as a member of the editorial team at Asiatic, which is the Journal of English Language and Literature. He's also a literary practitioner and has translated Malay literary works to English and published short stories.
Can you hear me? Thank you to Joanne and Simon Fraser University for organizing this session. I'm very excited to be here to talk about Joanne's work alongside Nadine and Cornell. And it's a bonus that Vancouver stands among one of my favorite North American cities. But just in case my colleagues see this recording, Seattle is also not a bad city. But from this side of the Pacific Northwest, we cast our gaze westwards across the Pacific Ocean, past the South China Sea, to the smallest city and nation in Southeast Asia, Singapore, a place half the size of the smallest state in the US, Rhode Island, but a locality that is known globally, as Joanne has pointed out, not always for the best reasons. The city-state, euphemistically known as the Lion City, has in the 21st century become such a fascinating cultural case study. Some, like Republican Senator Tom Cotton, would conflate, or to use Joanne's word, confabulate, Singapore to be part of China, right? When he consistently questioned TikTok founder Sʰwx of his affiliation with the Chinese Communist Party at a US Senate hearing in February. Many in Singapore, especially its ethnic minorities, know too well that Singapore has indeed been confabulated, purposely or not, as a province of China, when it's probably more accurate to describe it as an outpost of the US in Southeast Asia, one of several in the region. A situation that may be changing now. Like Joanne, I'm also Singapore-born, also partly educated there, and in fact, we were both journalists in Singapore. Joanne was a newscaster on TV, and I worked in Singapore's second best English language newspaper, which is now sadly reduced to a weekly, because, it's second best. We also shared the experience of being one of 10 then young Indian Singaporeans to have debated the late Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's first Prime Minister, for an election special, the first of its kind. Our background in journalism and now academia have led us to the work that we do today. So let us now turn to Joanne's book, Counter-Cartographies. I want to talk about my reactions to Joanne's book in three parts. First, the theme of nature as muse, and then on theory from below, and lastly on what I see to be the book's broader implications beyond academia. There are more ways in which one can approach Joanne's book, and we can possibly explore that during question time. Nature as muse. Here, Joanne's book is part of what I see to be a much welcome trend of scholarship that takes nature to be its organizing principle. Joanne writes a lot about the human need to master nature and refers to Singapore's attempts at creating artificial spaces, including artificial natural spaces like gardens by the bay, as you can see earlier, which she opens the book with in such a powerful manner. But even as she analyzes at length the nature of this artificiality, the book takes as its organizing principle the alarming artificiality of nature. Joanne touches on neo-colonial efforts of local elites behaving like elites of yore, the Singapore's British colonizers, at shaping and building the country's natural landscape in accordance to their master plan. You will encounter some choice quotes from Singapore's second Prime Minister about dreaming up a better version of Singapore that requires pruning everything, everywhere, all at once. Places like Jewel and Changi Airport must not only be seen as an infrastructure story, but as a symbol to epitomize all realms and possibilities of its citizens, or not all realms, but all dreams. I was missing a D there. We know these dreams, these utopic visions require building materials such as sand, which Singapore has brought so much in bulk at the expense of its neighboring countries, sand taken from the Mekong River. On this, Joanne's reading of sand excavation in relation to the artwork Sea State by Charles Lim lays bare destruction of this utopic desire of Singapore's utopic vision, ever expanding, always needing resources. Joanne's work of nature as muse refers to other work in this tradition. We see, for instance, a reference to Timothy Bernard, a Singapore-based historian who has written a number of notable works about nature and colonization in Singapore. Bernard has turned his attention to animals, a topic that I'm also working on, and I'm happy to engage with tomorrow at the talk, at my talk. Yeah. Here I can think of Faiza Zakaria's a very recent book, excellent recent book, called The Camphor Tree and the Elephant, published just last year. In it, Faiza talks about how nature has been rendered lesser to humans, a move that was enabled by a change in religiosity. She studied the community of indigenous folks at Sumatra called the Bataks. And the Bataks, they were previously enemies, pagans, but when they converted, because of colonization, converted to Christianity, but also Islam, there was also a change in terms of their mindset of looking at the non-humans previously as an equal partner in life to now something lesser, right? And so she points to a little bit of a disappointment in this kind of religious change. We know that at least one of those religions came with colonization. By taking nature as a muse, Joanne is in good company. It signals to us that this shift to what some might call environmental humanities, or eco-criticism, plant studies and animal studies, or post-humanism, this shift, whose name is Legion, is not an academic fad. Amidst the realities of anthropogenic climate change, can we not afford to take nature seriously? And I think the answer is that we cannot. This is one of the ways in which I have read Joanne's book, as an attempt to articulate the future of this fraught world that we are leaving behind for the next generation, and to make sense of the stained present that we have inherited from the generation before us. Let me now turn to theorization from below. In this book, Joanne refers to Brenda Yeo's work of colonial Singapore's refusal to, quote, cede spatial control of the cities to British colonizers, unquote, as an example of cultural geography from below, a move that she compares to James C. Scott's idea of infra-politics. Joanne's book does this exact same thing, but adds something more to this effort. To me, she has performed the act of situated reading, something that I am also hoping to do myself in my work. But while her book is published under the series Post-Colonialism across the disciplines, I think it has definitely also performed decolonial work as well. And just a quick qualification about the difference between the two. First, they both represent a formidable challenge to colonization as an intellectual endeavor. They could also be seen as complementary to each other, but post-colonialism reacts directly to colonization by attacking its very operation. So Edward Said analyzes Orientalist paintings, and Said Hussein Alatas, in his book Myth of the Lazy Native, analyzes the multiple ways in which British and Dutch colonizers have constructed the natives as indolents in Southeast Asia, the natives of Southeast Asia. In so doing, post-colonialism has used the very tools that were accorded to them in a sort of Caliban complex move to curse them with it. Right? So we see the recourse of rationalism, we see the use of logics, the very tools that inform colonization has been used to now challenge colonization. Decolonization, on the other hand, is an attempt at articulating modes of intellectualizing, which include attempts at constructing theory from below. And here Joanne's book allows for local works to dictate theory of theorization. She introduces novel ways of reading in the 4 chapters that she's used to excavate, circumvent, wayfind, and confabulate. These 4 techniques of reading Singapore works are very much welcome, because intensive urban planning of spaces is a very Singaporean thing. Not a day goes by in Singapore when there is no construction happening, as Joanne has pointed out. It is ever-changing, ever-hurtling towards that utopic vision that it never seems to be able to reach. And each time I return home in the summer to visit family and friends, I've always found some place to have disappeared. To this end, Joanne's scholarship on Singapore in this book draws from Singapore texts and sources with a mix of international work in there, because as NUS sociology professors Syed Farid Alatas and Benita Sina has said about the work of doing decolonial work, the point is not to replace important Western texts so that we can use them and then we can replace them with Eastern texts. It is to engage with Western works critically, to take the good and discard the bad, and it is also to expand our source for knowledge. In this book, I can see Joanne's scholarship critically appraise Singapore in itself, and not Singapore from an American or Canadian perspective. The work therefore can pave the way, I think, for doing Singapore cultural studies for its own sake. And lastly, the broader implications beyond academia. For me, approaching the work as a Singaporean academic, I think that this book is one of the most relatable scholarly work that I've read in a while. It feels bracing to see Singapore written with a critical gaze, unafraid of possible repercussions from political powers that be. But to expand on an earlier point about Singapore cultural studies, I think Joanne's book can act as a sort of blueprint and hopefully pave the way for others to do likewise. It is apt that this book is actually published by a UK press, because cultural studies began in the UK. The Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, started by Richard Horvitz and later helmed by Stuart Hall. However, such a work would not likely be published by a scholar who was going through tenure in Singapore, which is a sad state of affairs. Thus, the book is more than just a story about the pruning of nature by Singapore's political elites. It is also about the pruning of what Joanne calls in her book discursive spaces. Beyond academia, the book speaks to the state of intellectual scene in Singapore, wherein some of the best minds of my generation have not so much been destroyed by madness, but have flourished outside of the nation, and this account as some kind of madness. That some of Singapore's most lucid critics can only do it from the outside. It comes at a dear cost to Singapore itself, and this to me is madness. I speak of those of us who have subtly been made to seek their intellectual home elsewhere, some of whom are in this room, among the audience, people for whom I'm very proud to call friends. Singapore-born media studies scholar Cherian George, one such lucid critic, talks about the presence of a grey list as opposed to a blacklist of academics and artists. He writes, and I quote, "As a grey list member, you may be invited to give your views on certain matters, but you'll always be kept at an arm's length. Unlike those on the white list, you won't get a permanent seat at the table." He adds, "A place on the grey list is not as comfortable as it may look, because grey listers can never take the benefits for granted. It's always conditional on continued good behavior." Indeed, we might talk about a grey-listed diaspora of Singapore intellectuals, folks who have made their home in a variety of places around the world, though I would point out two satellite cities as key localities. Hong Kong and Vancouver, I think, is the other satellite city. The tagline, "Reading Singapore Otherwise," is so wonderfully apt in this sense, because barring fundamental changes to the philosophical underpinning to its political leadership, grey listing will continue, and excellent scholarships about Singapore, such as Joanne's, can only ever be written and read otherwise and from elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasri. Turn now to Cornell Bogle. Cornell writes, researches, and teaches in the fields of Black, Caribbean, and Canadian literatures, creative writing studies, autobiography studies, autobiography and biography studies, post-colonial, Black Atlantic and diaspora studies, and critical race, gender, and sexuality studies. Their critical and creative writing has been published in a wide range of journals, including Studies in Canadian Literature, Small Axe Salon, Canadian Literature, Arc Poetry Magazine, Pre-Caribbean Writing, and Topia, a Canadian Journal of Cultural Studies. Cornell also serves as an associate editor of the Journal of West Indian Literature.
Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me? It's an absolute pleasure to be here tonight among such esteemed colleagues and friends. I am excited about what promises, in the Q&A at least, to be a thoughtful and inspiring discussion. We have gathered to discuss Joanne's Counter-Cartography, a work that to me shines as one of the most intricately detailed and meticulously researched pieces of scholarship I've encountered in recent memory. I feel honored to share how this exceptional work connects with my fields of research, Caribbean studies, Caribbean Canadian cultural production, and diaspora studies. And I look forward to our rich exchange of ideas. So I want to start as a Jamaican in Jamaica, in 1692 in particular, where Kingston, the now capital, was meticulously designed to assert colonial control, serving as both a strategic and symbolic hub for British authority. Founded after the devastating earthquake that destroyed Port Royal, Kingston was situated just north of a busy harbor, a location chosen for its economic and military significance. Jamaica, by this time, had become one of the most valuable colonies in the British Empire. Sorry, Singapore. Thanks to its sugar production and its crucial role in the transatlantic slave trade. The plantation economy and the forced labor of enslaved Africans made Kingston vital for the British, and its urban layout reflected the need to maintain strict social order, especially given the frequent uprisings and resistant movements by the enslaved population. At its core was a Spanish-style square, which functioned as both the administrative and social center of the city. Surrounding the square to the northwest, imposing military barracks stood as a constant reminder of British dominance, while to the south, an open parade ground hosted regular military drills. This space served not only as a functional area for troops, but also as a public performance of imperial discipline and power, reinforcing colonial dominance through urban design. As Kingston grew, the significance of its calculated layout became even more pronounced. Encircling the parade ground, key institutions of colonial governments, such as churches, markets, municipal buildings, and a theater, were established, further embedding the British government's authority into the urban landscape. By 1870, the parade ground had been transformed into Parade Gardens, a genteel public park that still bore traces of its military origins. It was in this symbolic space that 5 marble statues were introduced, reinforcing an empire's cultural presence. The transformation of Parade Gardens was a deliberate reworking of space to sustain British authority in the post-slavery era, reminding the public that the colonial state still had power over the newly emancipated population. The most prominent of these statues was that of Queen Victoria, sculpted by Edward Gaflowski and unveiled in 1897. Queen Victoria, who reigned during the height of the British Empire, was immortalized in marble as a symbol of empire's reach, and Parade Gardens was then renamed Victoria Park. This statue was a part of a larger imperial strategy. Across the British Empire, Queen Victoria's likeness was replicated in marble and bronze, serving as a visual reminder of imperial power in cities from London to Kingston to Singapore. Over 161 statues of Queen Victoria exist globally, 86 in Britain and 75 throughout former colonies, each one a carefully placed symbol of British authority. The Queen Victoria statue in Kingston was actually a replica of a statue that had already been installed in Singapore in 1888, 9 years before the Jamaican version. Commissioned by the, and this is what they call themselves, Chinese Community of Singapore for Government House, the statue was emblematic of the British practice of circulating monuments from the empire's heart to its furthest reaches. This circulation of statues illustrates how the British use art and urban space to link distant colonies, creating a network of symbols that connected the empire's global territory to its core, the metropolis. However, by the mid-20th century, these symbols of imperial power began to face resistance. In 1966, during Queen Elizabeth II's state visit to Jamaica, a Rastafari elder protested colonial rule by physically defacing the Queen Victoria statue in Kingston. Rastafari viewed the statue as a false representation of protection and imperial motherhood, masking the deep wounds inflicted by colonialism. The Rastafari elders' act act, allegedly breaking the arm and scepter and placing gum in the statue's nostril, became a powerful metaphor for the declining grip of colonial power. Similarly, in Singapore, the Queen Victoria statue was reportedly damaged during demonstrations in the 50s or 60s before being restored in 1995. It still stands in the presidential, in the Istana, which are presidential grounds, I believe. These acts of defacement revealed the resistance to colonial symbols and the tensions between imperial authority and local communities seeking to assert their agency. These acts of defacement are not unique to Kingston or Singapore. Across former British colonies, similar actions have taken place as part of larger anti-colonial movements. More recently, movements like Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa have continued the tradition of challenging colonial monuments, signaling an ongoing global effort to reclaim public memory in spaces. This entanglement of space and power is further explored in Joanne's Counter-Cartographies, Reading Singapore Otherwise, where Joanne investigates how urban planning and architecture are used to regulate and control colonial, now independent subjects. Just as Kingston's urban design reinforced colonial authority, Leow shows how the colonial and post-colonial governance of Singapore shaped the island's landscapes, physical, social, and political. She traces Singapore's transformation through landmark projects like Marina Bay and Gardens by the Bay, celebrated for innovation, yet masking histories of state control and ecological exploitation. These developments, much like Caribbean spatial arrangements, are rooted in a legacy of colonial planning, which prioritized order, regulation, and control over local communities. In The Location of Culture, Homi Bhabha provides an analysis of how ambivalence is systematically produced, structured, and maintained within social power dynamics, particularly in colonial contexts. Ambivalence in this context refers to a psychological state marked by the coexistence of contradictory beliefs, causing individuals to oscillate between conflicting positions without finding a resolution. In colonial contexts, while authoritarians project ambivalence onto the colonized, it is the colonized who must navigate and endure psychological and social consequences of this imposed ambivalence. Despite these oppressive conditions, Bhabha identifies moments of agency for racialized subjects. He contends that although their lives are shaped by socio-historical realities of colonialism, they are not passive victims. Instead, they're capable of recognizing ambivalence and at times strategically utilizing it to subvert or navigate colonial power structures. Bhabha demonstrates how racialized subjects exercise agency and offers a compelling reevaluation of their roles within these power dynamics. Similarly, Joanne explores how individuals and communities resist spatial controls by creating counter-cartographies through literature, art, and film, offering alternate ways to conceptualize space and agency. Joanne's framing of Singapore within a broader global context of post-colonial resistance is one of the most compelling aspects of Counter-Cartographies. The defacing of Queen Victoria's statue in Kingston is one example of how Caribbean people have asserted their agency against symbols of empire, like the movements described by Joanne in Singapore. These acts of resistance were not isolated. They were part of a transnational network of anti-colonial efforts, where ideas, strategies, and inspiration flowed across borders. Joanne's work highlights how these connections continue to shape the post-colonial world, reminding us that the struggle to decolonize space and memory is a shared global endeavor. In approaching this text from the perspective of Caribbean post-colonial studies, its central questions deeply resonate with ongoing scholarly debates about space, culture, and resistance. The book explores a number of questions. What kind of art and culture can be made in spaces of authoritarianism? How do they resist co-optation and censorship? What insights can they give us into modes of witnessing and resisting such authoritarian productions of space? How can we move beyond the paradoxically overdetermined and uncertain future that haunts the conceived, perceived, and lived spaces of the post-colonial city. I'll also say that this is an accumulation of all the questions that I could find in the book. Now one paragraph. How can we learn, there's some different points in the book. How can we learn to see space beyond colonial and post-colonial maps? What has the mapping of post-colonial spaces sought to destroy, misremember, or erase? And how does art intervene in the production of imagined and symbolic spaces that coexist with their material counterparts? These inquiries are vital for understanding how art and culture not only survive under authoritarianism, but actively resist and subvert it. The questions also prompt us to consider how power dynamics are embedded in space, particularly in areas marked by legacies of colonial domination. As we engage with these ideas, we reflect on how artistic and cultural productions both mirror and challenge the spatial practices shaped by dominant powers. Specifically, the text's exploration of colonial mapping and erasures calls for a reimagining of space that prioritizes resistance, memory, and survival. This is crucial in contexts where post-colonial communities navigate and transform spaces inscribed with histories of violence, turning them into sites of possibility and creativity. One of the questions Joanne raises in the book underscores the difficulty of creating literary scholarship that addresses ongoing material realities. She asks, quote, "Do you truly hold textual and symbolic representations of space to be equivalent to actual material space? What are the dangers and possibilities of these slippages between fiction and so-called reality, between blueprint and construction, poem and everyday life?" To some literary scholars, this is a kind of question that we hear more as an accusation than a constructive question worth investigating. However, Joanne demonstrates that the question is worth asking and thinking through, as it might reveal our assumptions about what constitutes the domain, or assumptions about what constitutes the domain of the symbolic and the material. While reading Counter-Cartographies, I was reminded of how these questions have been concerns that I have been drawn to, not as a means of reaffirming my discipline, but of contemplating what knowledge exists beyond disciplinary boundaries, understanding that resistance knows no discipline. In my previous work, I studied how Caribbean Canadian writers, for example, such as Austin Clarke, depict relationships between men and the concept of self in urban Canadian experience spaces. I focused on how they challenge typical ideas of Black identity and masculinity, and how their writings contest colonial and anti-Black views of race and space. In my current research, I examine how Caribbean immigrants negotiate return migrations to their home countries, where spatial legacies of colonialism still persist. Leow's methodology, which treats artists as excavators, circumventors, wayfinders, and confabulous of authoritarian and capitalist spaces, provides a useful framework for understanding how return migrants also navigate the spatial politics of their home nations. While Joanne discusses Singapore, the most economically successful post-colony, I argue that this approach is equally valuable for an understanding of the spatial dynamics in Caribbean nations, many of which remain economically precarious. As the historian and reparations activist Hilary Beckles notes, the Caribbean is burdened by, quote, backward-built environments designed for the sole purpose of servicing imperial sugar plantations, a reality that continues to shape contemporary spatial politics of the region. This contrast, however, between Singapore and the Caribbean is not meant to imply a lack of connection between these two spaces. Singapore's success as a post-colony has positioned it as an aspiration for many Caribbean nations, as frequently reflected in often unimaginative regional headlines such as, "Why isn't Jamaica more like Singapore?" "The Singapore success model for Trinidad," and "The Caribbean needs its own Lee Kuan Yew." Caribbean diasporic subjects, particularly those returning from neoliberal states like the US, Canada, and the United Kingdom, bring with them symbolic understandings of space that either clash with or adapt to the colonial spatial legacies of their home countries. Joanne's insights into the interaction between material and symbolic spaces are crucial for understanding how these return migrants impose and resist such legacies. As a scholar as well of Caribbean popular culture, I also find Joanne's work valuable for reassessing the role of popular culture in resisting state power. In the Caribbean, popular culture, often depoliticized by politicians and religious leaders who dismiss the lyrics of musicians as vulgar, violent, and over-sexualized, serves as a powerful form of spatial resistance. Joanne's methodology allows for reevaluating of these cultural practices, recognizing them as acts of defiance against urban planning and spatial control. The spatial histories, for example, of music genres such as dancehall and soca offer rich examples for how these art forms have transformed spaces of colonial control and contemporary policing into arenas of protest, queer expression, and Black pride. These genres, often dismissed in political discourse, embody symbolic, social, and material reconfiguration of public space in ways that challenge the entrenched power structures of the post-colonial state. By foregrounding the spatial dimensions of artistic and cultural production, Joanne's work provides an invaluable lens for understanding how post-colonial subjects resist, reimagine, and reclaim the spaces they inhabit. In doing so, it offers crucial insights into the ongoing struggles over space, power, and representation in both Caribbean and global contexts. And so I'm delighted to celebrate this work, to continue having it animate conversations between friends and colleagues, and to watch its impact unfold as it makes its way into the world.
I just have some short reflections. Nothing so worked out and elaborate. So for years now, I've been working to surface the stories and knowledges of a variety of kinds of marginalized subjects in the inhospitable space of the colonial archive. Historians often conceive of such efforts to, as exercises in listening for what Ranjit Guha calls the small voices of history, and Tina Kant, following Paul Gilroy, the lower frequencies. But for me, this has come to require a practice of attention that is somatic as much as it is oral, visual, or mental, attuned to the possibilities of proximity, posture, and gesture, or what the cultural theorist Sarah Ahmed might call wiggle. For in a tight space, as Ahmed writes, sometimes what is needed, sometimes all you can do is wiggle. She writes, sometimes to create space, we have to wiggle about. You know those moments when you try and fit in a space that is smaller than you are. You wiggle now with purpose. By wiggling, you make more room for yourself. Wiggling is a funny word to say in an academic, that's one of the reasons I like it, but for her it is a somatic response that may or may not be willed, intended, but is, in Ahmed's terms, willful, an improper or queer way of moving that communicates discomfort with the conditions in which we find ourselves and begins the work of changing them. I think of Joanne a little bit as a practitioner and theorist of wiggle, and also of its limits. In a stunning essay first published in 2016, she moves between describing the dance of jiu-jitsu and memories of her maneuvers as a state television journalist in authoritarian Singapore. Wait for the smallest opening, the gap in which your opponent relaxes her grip on your wrists for just an instant. Later, there will be bruises, but for now, your body is so full of waiting that this barely registers. Wait for the gap, then destabilize her center of gravity, grab the sleeve of one hand, and push her over to her side. Begin again. In a poem first titled On Dissidence and later Diaspora, she describes the, quote, net pressing against your skin. Even if I worked quietly with a cutter on this side of the net to make the smallest opening, I do not think I would be able to wrestle you out. All I have left is to slip small, folded pieces of paper through the mesh. I curl each missive, push a series of them through. They are read in unconnected fragments. And in Counter-Cartographies, Joanne thinks and feels with four movements that are bodily as much as they are spatial and imaginative: excavation, circumvention, wayfinding, confabulation. Each archives and also entails practices for opening up space within the tight nets of post-colonial Singaporean authoritarian control that are also profoundly ethical in how they take into account the costs, erasures, violences of the world-making projects that precede or underpin them. For as Joanne details with devastating precision, the rulers of this small island have always sought to make more room through colonial capitalist technologies of expropriation, extraction, and erasure. In contrast to the creative texts that Joanne turns to throughout Counter-Cartographies, staging counters with both what was and what could have been, attending to alternative stories and practices of inhabitation that together unsettle the linear triumphalism of the state's Singapore story. This is particularly compelling to me as a person with ties to Hong Kong, another Asian island city-state and former British colony with a global reputation as a site of intensive capitalist development, if perhaps a little bit more, a little less manicured. Right? I think its global cultural imprint is one of, I think, griminess in a different way. Maybe? No, I don't know. The post-Second World War histories of Hong Kong and Singapore have diverged quite significantly. Whereas Singapore became self-governing in the late 1950s, Hong Kong was struck from the list of colonial possessions covered by the UN Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples in 1972. And under the terms of the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration, its sovereignty was instead transferred to China in 1997. Over time, however, the weight of authoritarian rule has come to be felt ever more acutely in Hong Kong as in Singapore, leading to an exodus fueled by the violence, most recently by the violent suppression of mass protests in 2019. Right? These are the million person marches, and the passage of national security legislation in 2020. And one of the places where that pressure has been felt is in Hong Kong's Victoria Park, right, which used to be the site of annual vigils for Tiananmen, right, and other protests. Those no longer take place. In print, film, and other media, we are now seeing a wave of attempts to document both those versions of the city that are under threat, as well as their erasure by the state. And many have been centered, and this was true of the protests in 2019, have been centered on direct engagement with or intervention in the physical fabric of the city. In her memoir, Impossible City, for example, Karen Cheung reflects on her desire to, quote, build a body of stories to archive our way of life. I didn't, she says, want to write about this place after everything had already disappeared, when I would have only me and my unreliable memory to reconstruct how I remembered this place. And so I wrote you this. In his 2022 documentary film Blue Island, meanwhile, director Chan Si-woon stages encounters between the survivors of earlier anti-colonial and pro-democracy struggles in Hong Kong and China and young veterans of the 2019 protests, who were invited to reenact their predecessors' experiences of protest violence, police interrogation, and fugitivity, in some cases awaiting detention themselves. Much of this archiving work is deeply affecting, showing how, under authoritarian conditions of post-colonial governance, struggle might only manifest in the smallest of gestures, or not at all. Writing in 2021, Hong Kong cultural critic Christina Chung, who I think is based at UW, drew attention to the proliferation of grassroots archiving projects during and following the 2019 mass protests, suggesting that we understand such archiving work as a form of radical action, as that is not just something that happens in the aftermath of radical action, but as integral to it. But the thinking that Joanne does in Counter-Cartographies has also helped me to articulate what feels nonetheless limited about some of these endeavors, what they miss or risk covering over in turn. I framed this archival turn as a response to this latest moment in Hong Kong's history as a site of protest and tightening authoritarian rule. But in fact, the fear of disappearance or proleptic loss has long been a key Hong Kong structure of feeling. And we're talking about cultural studies, a very famous book from 1997. The Hong Kong cultural critic Akbar Abbas, it's just called Hong Kong, A Culture of Disappearance, reflected on what he called the city's culture of disappearance, whose appearance is posited on the imminence of its disappearance. This notion of disappearance, he warned, does not connote vanishing without a trace. In fact, it can go together very well with a concern for presence and projects of preservation, as we can see in the efforts of both states to renovate colonial architecture, like, policemen's quarters and justice courts, right? Jail cells, often as part of art precinct projects. To quote Joanne, "This is not preservation, just another form of control." But I think that dissident projects of placemaking also risk conspiring with disappearance as an authoritarian strategy of control when they fail to acknowledge, as they sometimes do, perhaps often do, when they fail to acknowledge or otherwise account for those other space-making projects on which their own depend. Migrant workers, for example, service workers, sex workers. I take counter-cartographies then as a prompt to think carefully and critically about the space-making projects in which we engage, perhaps especially at removes of exile and loss, by asking what and whose city, what and whose history is getting imagined or forgotten in the process. And in the end, it is the genealogical affordances of the spatial projects that Joanne honors throughout counter-cartographies that feel to me most vital, most crucial, as means of countering the state's moves to innocence, as well as our own. Thank you. So we have exactly 15 minutes for discussion. I think if Joanne, do you want to respond to things that we've talked about?
I mean, I would love to hear from the audience, but I just wanted to thank all three of you. I mean, those were incredibly... Thank you for taking the time to read the book and for generously, thinking through it with your own work. And I was just listening to Nazri and thinking, yeah, I have those memories too of being a journalist. And also thank you for understanding how hard it was in many ways to write the book and where I was writing. And I want to talk to you more about Queen Victoria's statues and how we can get rid of them. No, and I think bringing up Hong Kong, Hong Kong's really been on my mind a lot. And I feel like the repressions that occurred in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s in Singapore are being compressed into half a decade, really, in Hong Kong. And I can see even the National Security Act is an echo of the Internal Security Act in Singapore. So there's so many ways in which temporality in Hong Kong, in terms of repression, appears to be moving so fast, but the space is transforming in similar ways, and it's strange and horrible, I suppose, resonances and echoes. So, I mean, thank you for thinking through and thinking with me. I really, it's a great pleasure and honor.